Hey, what's going on, everyone? Mike here in the BFH garage, moving forward with my project, the BFH suspension overhaul. I've got my mid-arm completely done now. Thank God, that was a lot of work, but now it is time to move on to the next phase for me, which is going to be the rear shock outboard. Now, the reason I waited to do this last, because you want to make sure when you're building your suspension, you progress in a way that the suspension is going to complement each other. What I mean by that is, you don't want to do your outboard first, because if you do your outboard first, then your angle of your shock will be different to your control arm than it will be if you wait till the end. So when you build a suspension, typically you want to start with your suspension lift. Let's just throw out a 4-inch suspension lift, get that done. After that, most people will do what's called a tummy tuck or a belly up. So they're going to get a flatter skid, they're going to get that all raised. You're going to notice that your pinion angles are going to change as you do this. You want to get all of that stuff dialed in before you go to your shock outboard. In fact, the shock outboard is one of the very last things you do when building a suspension. So moving on to this, I've had these parts on the shelf for a couple years now, embarrassingly to say, but I wanted to get that mid-arm on first. So now with the shock outboard ready to go, the reason we wait to the last moment is because you'll look at my control arm down there, it's at a certain angle. I want that shock to be perpendicular to that lower control arm. That's why I'm waiting until last. One of the things that you notice I did when I did the rear axle, since I already had everything out, I already went ahead, relocated my upper spring perches, and I also went ahead and removed my track bar mount because I eliminated the track bar. So if you're going to do an outboard project but you're retaining your rear track bar, this project's going to look a little bit different for you. I do have an older video on an outboard project that we did that will help shed some light on that. But I've got a lot of my ugly, dirty work out of the way, which is really nice, because now all I have to do is French in the towers to the frame, make sure my angles are right, and get it all burned in. So for me, the project isn't as daunting as it would be for somebody who still has to account for all of those other things, such as a spring perch relocation and a track bar mount relocation. So for me, I'm not going to have to remove my gas tank because I already have all the other dirty work done where you got to get it behind there. So that's going to save me a ton of time. Again, if you're doing something that's going to require you to change out your spring perches and all that, you're probably going to have to remove your gas tank. So keep that in mind. Again, go to the other video. It's a little bit older. The audio quality is so-so on it, but you'll get the information you need to continue on with this. Right now, what I got to do is I got to get some measurements, but before I do that, I have to put weight in the Jeep, and there's a reason for that. When you build your suspension, you want to account for the weight that's typically going to be in your Jeep. What that's going to do is it's going to give you a definitive number of where you want to be at ride height. And ride height is everything when you're setting your rear shocks if you're looking for a specific travel split. For me, I'm looking for a 6 up, 6 down, 50% travel is what I'm looking for in my shocks. I have 12-inch rear shocks. That is my goal. So I want to get all the weight I can in the back of my Jeep that I would normally bring with me. That includes my own body weight. And I'm going to get that number, figure out what the distance between my spring perches needs to be, and then I'm going to know exactly where I need to put this tower. So I'm going to walk you through all this in general terms, but right now, let's get the Jeep loaded up with everything I'm going to typically take on a run, and you're going to be surprised at some numbers you're going to see. Call me crazy if you want, but you need to understand this. When we are going to outboard our shocks, we need to account for what the actual ride height is going to be when you're out on the trail, not when your Jeep's sitting here empty in your garage and you're working on it. So make sure if you're going to do something and go through all of this work, take into account the things that matter. So what I did, it took a little bit of time. I had to gather up all my tools, put them in my tool bag. I had to go grab my soft doors and the door surrounds. I had to grab my go box that has extra jackets and water and stuff like that. I grabbed, another thing I grabbed were the actual shocks and the shock mounts that I'm going to use, because all that's going to add to this weight right now of where I'm at. So all of this stuff got added. In fact, if you look in the front seat there, you're going to see a pile of steel that weighs about 225 pounds, which mimics kind of what I weigh, pretty close anyway. But anyway, I have everything that I would normally take on the trail. This is it right here. I come back here, since I don't have any shocks in, I balance the back end, I get it to settle down exactly where I want it, I take a measurement. Now, and if you're wondering how much this makes a difference, before I get into the measurement, over here on the wall I have everything that I weighed. You're talking body weight, recovery bag, my go box, soft door surrounds. That one surprised me. My soft doors, uppers, lowers, and the door surrounds, that's 40 pounds. Didn't realize it was that heavy. Straps, my part box, my tools, a gallon of water, shock towers and shocks. How much you think all of that weighs, including me? So 225 pounds plus all of that. Over 431 pounds getting added on to the Jeep. Now, what I did try to do is I broke up where parts would be. So the surrounds are here, the steel's sitting in the front seat. Normally, my doors and surrounds are sitting back here because I don't run them unless it's absolute crap weather. But everything else is where it normally would be. My tools are on this side, and I put them on the side to offset weight balance and all that stuff, and that's the way it goes. So before I added all this stuff to my Jeep, I took my initial measurement with the back end being empty. 13¼ inches between my spring perches. So with the Curry springs I have in there, I have the LJ springs. So the LJ springs are 1/2 inch longer than the TJ springs. They tend to settle, so I went a little bit longer, knowing that I'd add this stuff in there and weigh it down a little bit. 431 pounds though, dropped at a full inch. So it went from 13¼ down to 12¼ My target was going to be 12. That gives me a 1/4 inch to play with if I want to add something else in there. For example, if I have a passenger or something like that. So not 100% exact, but pretty dang close for what I'm looking to do. And I'm making that up, trying to account for what may be in there later. So I'm going to go with that 12¼ measurement as my ride height. Everything else will be based on that. So I'm going to get some other measurements to get some reference points and stuff like that before I get all this stuff started. But I think there's a good lesson in helping people understand that when you're out there wheeling, the goal is to keep your Jeep as light as possible because you climb over everything a lot better. But it's amazing at how much stuff that's required that we actually need that we load into our Jeeps to go on a trail run. I think that's quite a bit. So, and I consider myself somewhat of a minimalist when it comes to taking spare parts. So, yeah, that's it right there. So let's get started on, I'm going to get these measurements. We'll get up on jack stands, get those tires off. We'll start getting to work. I don't know about you, but I was really shocked by some of those numbers. You're looking at the soft doors, uppers and lowers, along with the surrounds to weigh in at around 40 pounds. That surprised me. It's just surprising the amount of tools and stuff I carry. So if you take out the shocks and all the other stuff I talked about, I carry about 165, 166 pounds worth of stuff, not including myself. And to me, that seems like a lot, but it's all the necessary stuff I need to take on a trail. Moving on to the shock and the shock tower. This here is a Poly Performance tower. They sell these, somewhere right around $200 for the set. And I think that's a pretty darn good price. They give you the lower shock mount as well as the tower. Understand when you install the tower, the frame's going to come around somewhere in here. You're going to cut off the excess. So that's going to save you a few pounds on what you're dragging with you when you go down to the trail. The way this tower is designed is that you have to French your frame. So that means you're taking a big old notch out of your frame. You're going to leave just the backside of your frame. This tower is going to go into that recess. And then this shock body here will go inside the tower like this. You'll get it centered up. The lower part of the shock will be down here, and that's what completes your outboard. It looks very simple, and when you look at it in terms like that, it is very simple. However, the installation process is not that simple. This is a very big project. However, I do have a lot of my stuff out of the way, so it should be fairly straightforward for me today. With the tires off, the first order of business is going to be removing the bump stops. We need to get these Curry bumps out because they retain the spring. So we have to pull these out in order to get the springs out. Once we get these springs out, we are going to get this axle set right at ride height. We're going to take some measurements for some stuff. The axle sitting perfectly at ride height on both sides. I verified my pinion angle is good. My axle squared center. the suspension is sitting exactly where I want it in order for me to determine my perpendicular line here in relationship to the control arm. So if you look at the control arm here, the Johnny joint sticks down below the bottom of the control arm. So I took a piece of C-channel, I took some electrical tape, I just placed it right there. That way it lowers that plane down. And then what I can do is I can take a framing square here, put it right on the C-channel, and then come over here to the frame and make a mark on the frame of where that perpendicular line is going to be. So I take it, I put that there. Now what I'll do is I'll take my little 1-inch ruler and I'll make a series of lines just so I have a whole bunch of references on the angle of that line compared to the control arm. Next up, I need to get the lower shock mount tacked in place. You can see here where I've kind of removed some paint just to kind of get it ready to tack in place there. But the way you want to place this is the inside edge there goes right up against the outside edge of this. So I have a little bit of weld there, so it'll just tuck right up next to that weld. Now the question is, at what angle does that need to be? So the way I'm going to determine that is I'm going to use that same C-channel here. I have my angle finder on that, and I put my angle finder in line with the way the bolt's going to go. I'm going to zero out my angle finder. So that's zeroed out now to the control arm, and I'm going to take the angle finder, put it right on the bottom side of my mount here, and then I'll take it, I'll put the mount in place, and I'm going to try to get back to 0. With the lower shock mounts tacked in place, now what I need to do is figure out what my ride height will be for this shock. Now the problem with Fox shocks, these things are charged, so I can't just casually do that and leave it there. It'll extend all the way back out. So I need to find the mid way of travel. And the way I'm going to do that is I have my little clamp set up here. I'm going to compress a shock, let it extend, and then I'm going to close a clamp until I have exactly 6 inches. Then I'm going to measure eye to eye to see what my ride height will be. Well, those things are tough. So you have it right there. Let's see what my stem's showing. So I have 7.5, so I need to tighten this up until I only have 6 inches. Which is right there, exactly 6 inches of travel there. So that would be at ride height. That would give me 6 up, 6 down as far as travel. Now what I need to do is measure eye to eye, and I made sure that my heims in there are, they're perfectly flat, so I'm getting a good accurate measurement. And it comes out to 25 inches, maybe 25 and a 16th, but I'm going to call it 25, and that'll work. So what I need to do now, or what I already did, as you're going to find out right here, is I took some old heim joints off of an old anti-rock, and I made I'm going to call it a setup shock here. And what this will do, this is a setup shock that is extended or fixed, I should say, at ride height. So if I line up the hole there, it matches up perfectly with the hole there. I don't have to worry about trying to compress it or have it sneak out on me. It's a fixed length for ride height. Now, how is that going to help me, you say? Well, if you take the tower, I've already installed one end there, and you can see how these heims, I can move it around so that way if the offset is just a little bit different, it'll still slide right in. What I can do now is I can take this bottom heim, put it in the lower shock mount, and then I can set the tower up against the frame. I can kind of clamp it in place, making sure that my angle of my shock stem, which would be this piece of tubing here, matches the angle that I put up on the frame, and that would give me a perpendicular line to the control arm. The control arm would be sitting just like this, and it makes a perfect 90-degree angle at ride height. That's the intent behind it. Let's go play around with it and see if we can make it work. So as you look up close here, and this might be distorted a little bit because I have my camera on wide angle so you can see. As you look up close here, this line right here represents the perpendicular line to that lower control arm. That's the goal we're going for. And the reason behind that is if you could be completely perpendicular, then you're going to get a full 1-to-1 ratio out of your shock travel. Any degree you go either side of that, you're going to lose a little bit of that. So just keep that in mind. We always strive for perfect, but sometimes you just got to make stuff fit. And this is a prime example. So this line here represents perpendicular. This outside line here represents perpendicular. That line that goes off at a slight angle to the left, that is the actual mock shock angle that it's at right now. So that's what I had to compromise on. And the reason we have to compromise, if you look at the tub here, you see this big old bulge pull-out thing. It goes over the top of the frame there. So I can't move the tower forward because then it'll get into that bulge. I won't be able to get that bolt in there and everything else that goes along with that. As you can see right now, there's a nice little recess behind the tower that tower can slip right into. So that is the whole purpose of compromise and why we do things this way. Now, the one thing I did do was I took and I hammered off or broke the tack welds and took off the lower mounts. Those were not where I was hoping they were going to go. And that's fine because that's what I had to do to compromise. So what I did is I took my mock shock that I made. I inserted the lower shock mount to the mock shock up to the top side. And what you do is you get a whole tower thing. Everything moves together, whole bunch of different moving parts. And then you can see I have a clamp there on the left side to hold the tower in place. You've got to constantly move and fine tune and get this exactly where you want it. This is one of those projects where if you have an extra set of hands to help you, it will pay huge dividends. I mean huge dividends. I needed 3 hands the entire time, and you can do it by yourself. It just adds an enormous amount of time trying to get everything right without it falling out of place. So if you have an extra set of hands, good for you. That's really going to help out here. As I set this all up now, since I can't be perpendicular to the lower control arm, what I opted to do then is you want to keep this eye of the shock in the neutral state, because as it travels up, it's going to rotate back or forward. If it travels down, it's going to rotate back or forward. And you want to make sure it's in its neutral state at ride height. That way you're not going to have any chance of bind during the range of travel. So this mock shock comes down here. The top of this mount right here is parallel to where the bolt goes. So I put a square piece of metal here to make sure that I have a perfect 90 degree there. That is critical in this shock setup here. So I have that 90 degrees. And then after that, moving the mount back to where it fits is the other part of that. The other thing you have to do as you do this now is you got to take a measurement from your shock there. Mine's roughly 3 1/4 both sides. And that puts the stock shock or the setup shock in its neutral state in the tower, right in the middle, so that way it can go forward, backwards, equal. So that's kind of the whole gist of this. This whole thing requires a lot of little bitty movements, and I cannot stress enough, you want to double, triple, quadruple check everything. Once you're comfortable with that, then what I'm going to do next is I'm going to tack weld the lower mounts in place. And then I'm going to mark the towers where they're at so I can prepare those to cut the frame. And we're going to come back in and tack it in just to see if everything is correct. If that's the place it's supposed to be, then what we're going to do is remove the tower again. We're going to cut off this whole bottom half here. So all this right here is excess. Once we make sure we're 100% certain where we want to be, then I'll cut off the excess. And I'll probably leave it about 3/8 of an inch below the frame there, so that way weld will have something to stick to there. One thing I almost forgot to mention is when you get this side or whatever side you're working on first, when you get that side set up and you know it's set up perfectly, you want to match the other side to this one. It is critical that you get those on the same plane. One of the things that I did to kind of help me out, and it makes it go a little bit quicker, is I take an angle finder, put it on the side of the tower, and I figure out what the angle is here, take it to the other side, I match that angle, and that kind of gets me in the ballpark. The other thing I do is I will take a measurement from the frame to the top of the tower. That gets me in the ballpark. After that, everything is fine tuning. You really got to pay attention because things on the backside, like these little panels here, they're not exactly the same on both sides. So try to take measurements from certain things to make sure you're where you need to be could be misleading because a lot of this stuff is not exactly the same. So take that into consideration, double, triple check, quadruple check before you make any cuts. Here you can see where I put the outlines of the tower right there. I drew right next to it. When you make these cuts, you want to be cutting to the inside of this line because it's easier to take away more material than it is to add it. Don't forget, you need to put your cut marks up top, and then if you look on the bottom side, you're going to see where I have it back to the frame rail there, so I know exactly where I need to cut out. So a lot of work, a lot of more grinding dust, yay. Woo, what a day. All right, with everything tacked in place, we have everything trimmed down. We have the backside here, and I'll probably show you this when we go to weld it up. But if you cut a notch right here in your tower, it'll allow you to get the top side of that frame that you can't get a welding gun back in there to get. So you put like a little 1/4 inch notch, you close it back up, it'll attach the backside of the frame, and this all becomes strong. So now that we have the tower all set, time to place in the shocks, and we're going to run it through its cycle. Shocks are all set in place. Now it's time to run it through a cycle and make sure suspension is not going to have any hangups. Now, a couple things you want to do. Number one, install your bump stops if you're using Curry bumps, because when those touch, you want to check the shock stem and make sure you still have about 3/4 inch of shock showing, because those bump stops will compress. The other thing you want to do is disconnect your sway bar, otherwise you're not going to get that travel. So let's run up full bump, see what we get. All right, full bump stops are touching. We have just about 3/4 inch. That was kind of nice to see. Good, all right. And this is exactly why we cycle the suspension. We're looking for any interference issues. I still have to fix my brake line, so don't worry about that. But what I discovered was once I put my tire on and take it to full flex, so my driver's side was all the way droop, my passenger side was full flex, and coming up, it was making contact with the shock body. Normally, this doesn't happen. So as I investigate a little bit further, I realized that I put on replacement axle brackets down here. Now these are 1/4 inch thick brackets. Stock they're about 1/8 inch thick, if that. So and stock has a little bit of a lip that comes out that you have to cut off if you're going to use this lower shock bracket. But this 1/4 inch is huge. The other part of that is I put a big old fat weld all the way around because I don't want this thing to break. So when you look at the gap I have there, that is huge. This side of the bracket right here should be sitting about the halfway point of that bracket. So I have about 5/16, almost 3/8 of an inch that I've outboard that I need to bring back to the inside. I posted last night, thought I was really close, didn't think it was going to take me much longer. Well, as you do these things, you learn this is part of the game. Here's what I'm talking about. When you come under here, I have the driver's side full droop, this side almost full stuff. I probably have about 1.25 inches there left. And when you look up here, you see that little bit of gap right there between the tire and the shock body. I think if I go up with that extra 1.25 inches, I'm still going to be okay. The thing that I need to take into consideration though is over here, and that is where the shock body meets the tower. So when you see that right there, I stopped it right as it started kissing it right here. So what I need to do now to make up the difference is I'm going to have to cope this out a little bit and put a bevel on it so the shock can go that way enough for me to get that other 1.25 inches on the other side. That is how close this game can be. One of the things I also had to do was my lower mount, I had to move more inboard than I thought I was going to have to by quite a bit. But hey, this is what it's all about if you want perfection. I am now 100% confident that I am max of where I can be. And what I mean by that is I can't make any more adjustments to this that would allow anything to gain any more clearance or tire stop rubbing or anything else like that. The tower is 100% pushed flat against the inside of the frame on that side. There's no lip up top or anything like that. That is completely pushed flat to the inside of the frame, and my lower control arm mount is pushed as far in as I can make it go because I start contacting the shock body here. So I know I'm where I need to be. All I have to do now is weld everything in place, get it all set up, and then I'll run the tires on there, check for any interference issues. Initially I had some back here and I probably still will. So I have to clearance out my armor and stuff like that. That's fine and dandy, but I have some other things I need to do the axle too. I need to get my brake lines all connected and routed around that bracket and all that. I pulled them out of the way so I can weld. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the shock bodies now, and I'm going to put the springs back in. I'm going to pull this thing out, turn it around, bring it back in so I can put it up on the lift and do a bunch of this work where it's right in front of me instead of me being upside down. So that's where I'm headed next, and we'll get up on the rack, and then I'll take some pictures of the finished product, and you can see what it all looks like. Last thing I need to do for this outboard is get the remote reservoirs mounted to where they're out of the way of getting rubbed at with the tire and stuff like that. You don't want to jam it all the way up to where it rubs on the body. You want to pull it in just a little bit right there. Bunch of different ways you can do this. They, where are they at? They provide some kind of brackets here that you can use, but you can see how some things just aren't going to fit right. So I choose to make a homemade bracket, and let me show you what this is here. So it's nothing more than a piece of steel bent. What it was part of my old roll bar. I kept some chunks of that, and it happened to be a 2-inch inside diameter. This is a 2-inch outside diameter. So I have that slight little curve there that will hold the reservoir there. Originally, I made these twice as thick, and I started thinking about it. These things are designed to dissipate heat. So the more steel you're going to have wrapped around it, you're going to create or retain heat, and I don't want to do that. So I made it as thin as it needs to be. Once I get it all mounted here, I'm probably going to put a real light layer of felt or something like that just to keep it from rubbing it raw or whatever. So you're going to take the mount for the bracket, I guess, for the to mount the reservoir. and I'm going to push everything all the way back and then come in just slightly. I don't want to be all the way to the outside edge because that tire can get into there. Now I've already done the other side. I want to be at, from here to here, approximately 6¼ inches. So I need to adjust that back a little bit. And then what I'm going to do is take the bands, put these on, and I'm going to tighten it down to make sure that this, the mounting bracket stays flat to the tube and it doesn't get bowed or anything like that. And then I'll pull the reservoir out once I get it tacked in place. So not a whole lot to it. A little bit of time building the bracket for the mount, but you know, I'm on the tail end of this one, and I'm telling you what, this is a big project. This one kicked my butt, especially that lower side mount there. So let me get after this, and we'll be back in just a second. Got it all painted up last night, let it dry. So now I need to install the shock and run it through the cycle again. I want to make sure that it's going to clear that the tower the way I had to carve it out there a little bit. And if I get that to clear, we're in great shape. Then I could finally put everything back together, get the springs in, get the brakes all bled, all that kind of stuff. So we're real close. Sway bar disconnected, full bump here. I still have to try it with the tire on, but for right now we're full bump here. And then come to the other side, and I'll show you the clearance we have from that other shock. So full bump on the driver, complete droop on the passenger. And when you look right up here, we're worried about the shock between this, and I could just fit a piece of cardboard right behind that shock. That is set up absolutely perfectly, as good as I can get it. Now we just got to verify the tires won't rub. Tire at full bump, you can see clearly I'm going to have to clearance out my corner armor there, which isn't a big deal. The thing I wanted to make sure was that my shock wasn't rubbing the tire. And as you look up there, you can see I have maybe 1/8 inch gap there. So I tell you what, it is a ton of hard work to get this dialed in exactly the way you want it. And I mean, this is an absolute ton of work. I'm so glad that I took the time to finish those little finite details. You have to get it perfect for everything to play together. If not, tire rubbing into your shock body sucks. There's nothing good about that. With all that done now, I can start putting everything together, get my brakes bled and all that stuff, but the rear outboard is complete. This officially ends the rear shock outboard project. Everything's hooked up, got my shocks all installed, bolted, tightened down, my remote reservoirs where it needs to be, reinstalled the springs, bump stocks, and the sway bar. Everything is exactly where it needs to go. It is unbelievable the amount of time and effort you have to put in to building a good, complete suspension. Very tedious little work is what gets you home, and taking the time to make sure everything is exactly where it needs to be makes all the difference in the world from something working or not working. I had a little bit of a struggle with the lower shock mounts, getting those exactly where they needed to go. So the shock at full bump, full stuff on one side wouldn't make contact with the tower there. Just a ton of work to get done. I promise you, take your time, make sure you're going the extra mile to get this stuff done, because in order to get it done right, you're gonna have to do all that little small work. So that's it for now. My next project coming up is, let's see, it should be the front shock relocation / outboard. However, I may have to postpone that a little bit. Some things come up at work and at home that I have to take care of. So I'll probably be working on some smaller, less tedious type of work, such as some lighting stuff and things like that. So really minor stuff, but that's it for today. Hope you're enjoying this series. If you guys have any questions, keep posting them in the videos like you've been doing, and we'll see you on the next one.